He has the wildest hair on television, a theory that most historians refuse to touch, and a face that has been turned into one of the most recognizable memes on the internet. But before the cameras, before the punchlines, and before the sold-out conventions, he was just a kid in Switzerland who couldn't stop thinking about the stars. This is the story of how a communications graduate from a small liberal arts college became the most famous ancient astronaut theorist on the planet, and how the internet's biggest joke turned into one of its most enduring pop culture icons. Giorgio A. Tsoukalos was born on March 14, 1978, in Lucerne, Switzerland. His father was Greek, his mother Austrian, and the household he grew up in blended alpine discipline with Mediterranean storytelling. Switzerland gave him structure. Punctual trains, tidy villages, a culture built on precision. But his last name carried the weight of something older: myth, gods, and the epic tales of ancient Greece. It's a strange combination for a future television star. Most of the country, he grew up in valued order and quiet routine. Yet somewhere in that mix, a restless imagination was forming, one that would eventually pull him thousands of miles away from the mountains of his childhood and into a spotlight nobody could have predicted for him. The turning point, as Tsoukalos has told it many times over the years, came from his grandmother. She handed him a paperback copy of Erich von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods, the controversial 1968 bestseller that first popularized the idea that extraterrestrials may have visited humanity in the ancient past. He was still a boy. He didn't fully grasp the arguments, but something about the pictures of pyramids, carvings, and unexplained monuments lodged itself in his mind. Years later, as a young adult, he picked the book back up, and this time it hit differently. It wasn't a strange curiosity anymore. It was a lens through which he suddenly saw the entire ancient world. Here's the part that surprises most people. Tsoukalos didn't study archaeology, anthropology, or history. He attended Ithaca College in New York, where he earned a degree in sports communication, graduating in 1998. He wasn't sitting in lecture halls debating hieroglyphics. He was learning how to write press releases and cover athletic events. But that background ended up mattering more than anyone expected. Tsoukalos didn't approach ancient mysteries the way an academic would, with careful footnotes and peer review. He approached them the way a broadcaster approaches a big story. Find the hook, build the drama, make people lean in, whether or not you buy his theories. It's hard to deny that his made-for-television instincts were part of what eventually made him famous. Before any of that fame arrived, though, there was another world entirely: bodybuilding. Tsoukalos spent years working behind the scenes of professional bodybuilding events. Starting as a volunteer at competitions like Mr. Olympia, he worked his way up to organizing and promoting shows himself, eventually running one of the bigger competitions on the West Coast, the San Francisco Pro Grand Prix. He built relationships with some of the biggest names in the sport during that era. It was a world obsessed with spectacle, branding, and putting on a show for a crowd, skills that would later translate surprisingly well to hosting a cable television program about ancient civilizations. While he was still deep in the bodybuilding scene, Tsoukalos started something else on the side: a magazine. In 1999, at just 20 years old, he co-founded Legendary Times, a publication devoted entirely to the ancient astronaut hypothesis. He wasn't just a contributor. He was the editor, the publisher, and eventually the public face of the whole operation. It was a small operation at first, the kind of niche magazine most people never hear about. But it filled a gap. There wasn't another publication quite like it, one asking, in earnest, whether ancient monuments around the world might have extraterrestrial origins, and trying to frame those questions using the language of research and evidence rather than pure speculation. Running the magazine put Tsoukalos in contact with some of the biggest names in the ancient astronaut community, including Erich von Daniken himself, the author whose book had started it all for him. The two developed a working relationship, and Tsoukalos eventually became associated with von Daniken's research organization. That connection gave him credibility within a very specific, very devoted community, long before mainstream television ever took notice. Tsoukalos' first notable television appearance came in 2002 on a revival of the classic series In Search of. He was introduced with a title that overstated his academic background, which didn't sit well with historians and archaeologists once his real credentials became public. But it opened a door. Over the next several years, He picked up smaller appearances on documentary programs exploring fringe science and unexplained phenomena. These early spots were essentially auditions for him and for the networks. Could a guy with wild hair and a communications degree hold an audience's attention while making sweeping claims about ancient civilizations? The answer, it turned out, was yes. By the mid-2000s, he was a familiar face on cable documentary programming, appearing on channels built around mystery and speculation. Then came 2009, the year everything changed. The History Channel greenlit a new series called Ancient Aliens, and Tsoukalos became its most visible and consistent voice. What started as a single documentary special turned into a full series, and the series turned into a phenomenon that has now run for well over 200 episodes across more than 20 seasons, still producing new installments today, including a companion series, Ancient Aliens, Origins, that revisits some of the show's most talked about theories. No single moment defines Tsoukalos' public image more than what happened in late 2010. Clips of him on Ancient Aliens, delivering theories with total sincerity and a head of hair that seemed to defy gravity, started circulating online. Users began pairing his image with a caption along the lines of, "I'm not saying it was aliens, but it was aliens." The phrase wasn't something he actually said on the show, but it captured his tone so perfectly that it didn't matter. The meme exploded. It jumped from message boards to Reddit, Tumblr, Facebook, and eventually every corner of the internet where a reaction image could be dropped into a conversation. People use it to joke about anything unexplained, a missing sock, a weird coincidence, a conspiracy theory of any flavor. For a huge number of people, that meme was their introduction to Tsoukalos, long before they ever watched a full episode of his show. Most public figures would bristle at being reduced to a punchline. Tsoukalos leaned into it instead. In interviews over the following years, he repeatedly said he considered it an honor to have become part of internet culture, and he made a point of engaging warmly with fans who brought it up. That willingness to laugh along, rather than fight the joke, is a big part why the meme never turned into resentment. It became affection instead, the kind of internet fame that actually builds a fan base rather than destroying one. The recognition eventually made its way into scripted television, too. In 2021, he appeared as himself in an episode of the sci-fi comedy Resident Alien, playing off the show's premise with a wink at his own reputation. He returned for a second cameo the following year, cementing his status as more than a meme, a genuine, if unconventional, piece of pop culture. Ancient Aliens alone would have been enough to make Tsoukalos a recognizable name, but he didn't stop there. In 2014, he stepped into the host chair for his own spin-off series, In Search of Aliens, on the H2 channel, which had him traveling the globe to investigate specific mysteries rather than sitting in a studio. He also became a fixture on late-night radio, appearing regularly on Coast to Coast AM, a program famous for covering paranormal and unexplained topics for an audience of night shift workers, insomniacs, and curious skeptics alike. But two of his most consequential media appearances came on the Joe Rogan Experience. Long-form conversations gave him room to lay out his theories in far more detail than a cable documentary segment ever could, and introduced him to a younger, largely male audience that hadn't necessarily grown up watching the History Channel. More recently, Tsoukalos took his message on the road. In 2024, he launched Ancient Aliens Live, a touring stage show featuring himself alongside other well-known figures from the ancient astronaut community, including researchers like David Childress and William Henry. The tour hit theaters across the country, drawing crowds willing to pay anywhere from around $40 for general admission up to premium prices for VIP experiences. Though, notably, autographs aren't part of the deal, a rule put in place after early shows saw a line stretch far longer than organizers anticipated. He's also become a regular presence on the convention circuit, speaking at events around the world and leading guided tours to some of the sites his theories are built around, places like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey and Pumapunku in Bolivia. For fans, the appeal isn't just watching him talk about these places on a screen. It's standing next to him in front of the stones themselves. At the heart of everything Tsoukalos does is a fairly simple, if enormously controversial, core belief that many of humanity's great ancient achievements weren't purely the product of human ingenuity alone. He's pointed to sites like Pumapunku, with precisely cut stone blocks as evidence that ancient builders had access to tools or knowledge more advanced than conventional archaeology accounts for. He's made similar arguments about the Egyptian pyramids, suggesting that their apparent architectural sophistication appeared too quickly in the historical record to have developed gradually the way mainstream archaeologists describe. Professional archaeologists and historians have pushed back on these claims for decades, and that pushback hasn't been gentle. Since Ancient Aliens premiered, publications and scholars have repeatedly labeled the ancient astronaut hypothesis pseudoscience, arguing it disregards established evidence about how ancient societies actually developed their engineering and building techniques. Tsoukalos has never shied away from that criticism. If anything, he's used it as fuel, arguing publicly that intense pushback is itself a sign that his ideas are hitting a nerve. That combativeness has occasionally spilled into personal disputes. One of the more well-documented feuds dates back to the early 2000s, when a young journalism student turned critic challenged his claims directly. What started as an interview reportedly turned tense, and the disagreement continued for years afterward through public statements and online exchanges. It's the kind of rivalry that, love it or hate it, has followed Tsoukalos throughout much of his career, a reminder that his theories provoke strong reactions in both directions. Even within more formal academic settings, he hasn't avoided the fight. In 2022, he took part in an Oxford Union debate, standing in front of a room full of skeptical scholars and defending his positions directly. Whatever you think of the arguments, it takes a certain kind of confidence to walk into that room in the first place. For someone this visible, Tsoukalos has kept a surprising amount of his personal life private. He married Chrissy Beale in March 2013. She's a glass artist who sells her work online, and by most accounts, the two share a life that looks a lot more ordinary than his television persona might suggest. Tsoukalos has spoken about wearing pieces of her jewelry during filming, a quiet, personal detail tucked into a very public career. Beyond that, he said very little about his family or personal history, and he's chosen to keep the focus squarely on his work rather than his private world. It's a notable contrast in an era when most public figures share nearly everything. Whatever Tsoukalos' critics think of his theories, few would accuse him of chasing attention through his personal life. Nearly all of his fame has come directly from his ideas and his willingness to defend them on camera. Looking back at the full arc of his career, it's a strange and genuinely unlikely path. A kid in Switzerland reads a book his grandmother gives him. He studies sports communication instead of archaeology. He spends a decade promoting bodybuilding shows while quietly running a niche magazine on the side. And somehow, all of that experience, the storytelling instincts, the promotional skills, the comfort in front of a crowd, comes together at exactly the right moment to launch one of the longest-running and most talked-about shows in cable television history. Whether you think the ancient astronaut theory holds any weight or dismiss it entirely as entertainment dressed up as research, it's hard to argue with the cultural footprint Tsoukalos has left. He turned a niche fringe theory into mainstream conversation. He turned a mocking internet meme into a badge of honor. And nearly 2 decades after Ancient Aliens first aired, he's still touring, still filming new episodes, and still asking the same wide-eyed question that made him famous in the first place. What if we've had the story of our own history wrong all along? Love him or laugh at him, Giorgio Tsoukalos built a career almost nobody could have predicted, and he's not done yet.